everyone, my name is Laura and this is Aeroclass Expert Talks. When we travel with airlines, we usually only think about what we pay them and not the airline's expenses for transferring passengers from point A to point B. We tend to forget that airlines also pay air navigation service providers and airports a particular fee which allows them to provide their service to passengers. And if you're someone who has always wondered about this and you wish to know more about what kind of expenses airlines deal with, you've come to the right place. Or, well, pressed on the right video. The best person to tell us about what hides behind mentioned charges and explain the economics of aviation better is Aeroclass instructor, associate professor at Singapore Institute of Technology, Volodymyr Bilotkach. Thank you very much for joining me.
It's my pleasure.
So what I spoke about, airport and other charges, is the topic of Volodymyr's course at Aeroclass, and he'll have a chance to better explain what to expect there. However, first let's get to know you better. So my first question, as always, is how did your aviation career start, or at least your career with aviation start?
Okay, well, actually, I do have a story behind it, and well, I think that I have always wanted to be involved in transportation in one way or the other. Well, you know how teenagers, they tend to have posters in their bedrooms, right? Well, mine was the schedule for Kyiv's Central Railway Station. Yeah, no kidding. Actually, that was the poster in my bedroom as a teenager. And then I went on to study economics without kind of really knowing what it was, since it was like early 90s. The Soviet Union has just collapsed. Ukraine has become an independent country. And this was like this new thing that everybody was interested in. And then later my interest in the subject developed to such an extent that I ended up in Arizona doing my doctorate studies. As I started doing that, I started looking for sort of ways to get to and from Ukraine as sort of inexpensively as possible. And this has led me to learn a thing or two about kind of how the aviation industry has been functioning, how it was working. And I decided to actually make economics of aviation a topic of my dissertation. And I have written my dissertation on economics of the transatlantic airline markets, including the some regulatory peculiarities at the time, such as entry restrictions at Heathrow Airport, and also on airline alliances. And I somehow stayed in this area of work to the extent that now I am, since actually the beginning of this year, I'm a co-editor-in-chief of Journal of Air Transport Management, which really is kind of the main scholarly publication in this area. And while most of my academic career, I was teaching economics, I also got involved eventually with executive education, teaching intensive policy and policy regulation economics courses to aviation industry professionals. And so that's how I eventually got involved with Aeroclass as well.
So it's kind of interesting because all my previous guests here, all the other Aeroclass instructors, are usually people that held positions or are still holding positions in airlines, airports, some kind of consulting firms. But you are very much familiar with academia side of things, and you just kind of focus on aviation in your research. And I know that you've written, I think, about 40 different papers for journals, and you've written a book, and you are, as you said, an editor for a journal. So, and kind of going to teaching as well, what do you think is harder, putting your findings and thoughts on a paper, let's say a book, or teaching students in a course?
These are different things, and each has its own kind of challenges, right? So when you teach a course, you have to sort of read the room, right? You have to kind of understand how the students are perceiving what you're teaching, which it actually can be a bit difficult with all the online teaching that we have to do. And sometimes you actually have to change what you do on the fly. So let's say if you start telling a story, let's say a motivating example, which I have, of course, a collection, which I have accumulated a collection of, obviously, and you see that it's not really working out, then you may need to adjust quite quickly. Or if you see that a certain topic is kind of above the level of the students, or on the other hand, it's just too trivial for them, again, you may have to adjust quickly. But then when you write, you face a totally different challenge, which is that you don't really know who is going to be reading your paper, and you need to sort of make it, first of all, well, on one hand, accessible to everyone or to every potential reader, and on the other hand, you do not want to make it sort of too easy to read or not rigorous enough, so that some of the more advanced readers may sort of not be interested. So you see, it's these are really different activities, each with a separate set of challenges.
Right, and talking about challenges, obviously your career is still going on, but there must have been something that really stands out now when you think about it. What is the most challenging assignment that you've had so far?
Well, it's not so much an assignment as I would say that the most difficult decision that I have made was when I decided to actually accept the offer from Singapore Institute of Technology to come and teach here, since here I'm teaching in the air transport management program, whereas previously I was teaching in sort of economics department, first at the University of California and then the business school, but still in the economics subject group at Newcastle University. And so I haven't really made a decision to shift my specialization from economics to aviation, and also the kinds of courses that I'm teaching here are different. So for instance, last trimester I was teaching for the first time the airline network planning, which is something that I have learned something about previously, but really I have never taught that as a course. So it was a totally new course that I had to develop. And also now I'm thinking that, well, okay, so now that I have moved to this aviation program, then, well, most probably it will be difficult for me to return to an economics department in academia. But I think that this was the right move for my career.
I'm glad to hear that. So now that you're a bit more involved with aviation as a whole, what, in your opinion, is the most important characteristic for someone working in this industry, or like a skill set that has to be with someone when they want to succeed in this industry?
Well, I believe that an analytical mindset is very important. So the industry produces quite a lot of data, so you need to know how to work with it. That's one thing that I think is very important. And the other thing is that this is a dynamic industry. A lot of things are actually changing on the background sort of as we speak. Even now when the sector is going through basically the toughest crisis that you can probably imagine in a peacetime, right? I don't like, it's kind of difficult for me to imagine anything more profound, like any crisis of a larger magnitude without kind of a war on the background, really. Even now things are changing, so new technologies are being deployed in the air navigation services. The airlines are upgrading their fleet to the next generation aircraft. New airlines are actually appearing. Not as many are going out of business as we feared when this crisis has started. And airlines are looking for new sort of business opportunities. They are acting kind of more opportunistically, so looking at where the travel restrictions are being relaxed and sort of just going there rather quickly. And to really make sense out of it, you do need sort of a solid analytical mindset.
You mentioned updates, and you mentioned kind of shifting towards some more kind of smarter choices and stuff like that. And of course, we have to mention e-learning here as well, because before the pandemic, I mean, there was still e-learning, but during this time, it became much more popular because now we are all in the comfort of our homes, learning from our computer or tablet screen, doesn't matter. But what do you think is currently missing in the supply of especially aviation e-learning?
Okay, well, I think that aviation e-learning suffers from the same kind of issues that the e-learning suffers in general, which is that we still have not really understood kind of how to kind of really introduce this interactive component, or the create this kind of a classroom microenvironment, if you will, that really helps both the teacher to teach and the learners to learn. When you have, let's say you are in a small room with, say, 10, 15, maybe 20 participants, which is what a course aimed at aviation professionals kind of normally looks like. You have sort of non-verbal communication both between the teacher and the participants. You have interactions between the participants, which are kind of very difficult to replicate in this kind of Zoom environment. You know, when you, let's say you say something and then two participants who are sitting opposite each other, they start sort of exchanging their thoughts, and this is not something that I often see happening sort of in the online environment like that. And I do believe that especially in courses aimed at the industry professionals, such interaction is a very important component. It really kind of adds to the learning experience. And I'm not sure yet kind of how to really kind of replicate that. And that is why I'm hearing from some people that indeed the learners, they really want to return to the traditional classroom environment to kind of get this interaction. But still, I do believe that the e-learning has a very important place in the future of executive education, if you will, especially when you want to transmit the knowledge on which is kind of maybe more of technical nature, or which has been kind of more or less codified, right? Such as actually the course that like a mini course that we will be talking about shortly.
Volodymyr, I want to know what attracted you to Aeroclass then, because of course this is an e-learning platform, and you've already made a video course and people can check that out on our website. So what was the main kind of reason that you thought, okay, I can actually do this and I want to do this?
There are two things at play here. First, more generally, of course, I, as most of the educators these days, understand that as technology is developing, the virtual learning will become an important part of the industry. And obviously, if you want to kind of continue to thrive in this industry, you need to develop your expertise in this area. But why Aeroclass specifically? It's about the people, actually. More specifically, Anka Gosling, whom I have known previously as from her previous job. And when I saw that she has moved to Aeroclass, I thought that, it looks like this is really, it told me immediately that this is the platform that has potential, because it has attracted the right kinds of people who have experience in executive education in aviation. So if anybody is capable of creating the e-learning platform aimed at aviation professionals, those would be people like Anka and like Madalina, whom I have known before.
Wonderful. Now let's introduce your course to our viewers. So please, Volodymyr, tell us about the course. Who is it aimed at, and what can people expect from it?
So this course is about the charges that the airlines pay to providers of aviation infrastructure, that is airports and air navigation service providers. And well, I believe that basically anyone working for airlines and who is interested in actually learning more about the costs that the airlines incur and how those costs can be managed should be interested in this course. And currently we are talking about sort of creating a series of courses on managing airline expenses, and this would be kind of the first of hopefully 3-4 more that will be created later, probably later this year. So how much money are we talking about? Well, in 2019, basically the last full year before the pandemic, was the first year when the airlines paid a total of just over $100 billion for to those providers, to the airports and air navigation service providers, which just to put this into perspective, the total airline industry revenue in that year was around $850 billion. So not quite, but almost 1 in every $8 of airlines expenses goes to pay for the aviation infrastructure. And in this course, I explain sort of the logic behind those charges. I explain different models of setting of airport and air navigation service charges. So in some cases, for example, the airports are told by the regulators how much to charge for the airlines. However, there are plenty of airports who actually have freedom to decide what those charges will be, and many airports also offer volume discounts to the airlines for bringing a certain passenger volumes or operating a certain number of flights. And when you sort of know about this kind of gives you at least some ideas for how to manage those expenses. So let's say if you know that an airport offers incentives for new services, volume discounts, etc., you can sort of plan your operations to that airport to try to maximize the potential of essentially to maximize the potential savings on those charges. And well, unfortunately, with air navigation service charges, you tend to have less less freedom, since in most cases those charges are set by the regulator. But then there are also other models around the world, as I explain later on. Then also in the course I give some examples which sort of show what components go into the airport and ANS charges. So for instance, the airports, they charge on the basis of the aircraft weight, but then also on the basis of how many passengers are on the flight. And then so for instance, in some cases an airport would charge predominantly on the basis of weight, regardless of how many passengers you as the airline bring to the airport, which basically means that the airline bears most of the risks associated with decline in demand, such as what we have just experienced recently worldwide. That is, whether you bring the full flight to the airport or your flight is half empty, you will pay roughly the same amount to that airport. But then if an airport charges predominantly on the basis of how many passengers you bring, then you share those risks with the risks of decline in demand are shared between the airline and the airport. So as the number of passengers decreases, so do the charges that you pay to the airport. But then with air navigation services, again, the charges depend on the aircraft maximum takeoff weight and the distance that you fly. And I explained in more detail how those relationships work out.
Thank you for that. For everyone who's interested, please visit iraclass.org, find Volodymyr's course, and start learning today about these charges. I want to get a bit more into the course, and in there you explain that there's an invisible part of an airport. So we as passengers only see the non-aeronautical side of things, but we tend to miss everything that's happening kind of behind the walls of duty free and our kind of gates. So what do passengers miss or fail to value that is vastly important?
Well, if you ever have a chance to actually look into that invisible side of the airport, which I once did have such a chance when I was involved in a consulting project for the Netherlands Competition Authority, when we were evaluating the issue of market power of Amsterdam Schiphol Airport. It is amazing sort of how many people there are sort of working behind the scenes and how much work they do, how much effort goes into basically making sure that your flight pushes off the gate or the parking position in time. So there are lots of activities going on. So the aircraft is being refueled, and you have baggage handling operations, and you have various people kind of planning various aspects of the operations on the ground, and there is just a tremendous amount of activity going on. But that is why the airlines have to pay all this money to sustain those activities, without which there would be no air traffic.
Yeah, because I guess we tend to, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we tend to forget about these things. We kind of focus on, going on a trip, going on a holiday or a work trip, and we just kind of, see our baggage coming to us when we kind of left it off in the previous airport. We don't really get, into the details, how it travels. There's also another thing that you talk in your course, and that is 3 different regulatory regimes that airports do. So one is a single tail, then is a dual tail, and a hybrid. So which is more beneficial to airports and which is better for airlines? And if you don't mind, can you just simply explain the differences between those 3?
Okay, so the single versus dual versus hybrid tail, this notion has to deal with how the profits that the airports make on non-aeronautical side, that is all the duty-free parking charges, etc. Well, they're renting out the space to shops and restaurants, right? The airports make money out of that, and we call this non-aeronautical side of the airport because this is the money that is not collected from the airlines directly, and how those profits interact with the cost of providing the aeronautical activities, that is basically what happens on the tarmac, on the runway, to finally form the charges that the airport sets for the airlines. So under the single tail regulatory regime, what happens is that the charges, are used to offset some of the costs on the aeronautical side. So for instance, if the cost on the aeronautical side is $100 million and the airport makes $20 million profit on the non-aeronautical side, then the airlines are charged only for $80 million, which is 100 minus 20. And this is definitely something that the airlines want. Why? Because they pay less, right? So it's simple as that. And if you, let's say, go to IATA's website and sort of look for single tail or something like that, you will immediately see a series of documents where IATA will claim that this is what airports have to do, but this is what airports should do. All airports have to basically do single-tail charges, or rather, all the regulators should mandate that the airports charge the airlines according to the single-tail principle. And this is understandable because IATA's mission is to represent the airline industry, right? And so they will advocate for policies that lower the airline's costs. But then does this mean that dual-tail, which is the arrangement where there is no offsetting, simply because when an airport charges less to the airlines, the law of demand works, and the airlines might as well just bring more passengers to the airport. So if you pay less to the airport, you might actually start scheduling more flights into it. Well, of course, there is underlying demand on the route, but this can play a role on the margin. And this means for the airport, that it will be able to earn more non-aeronautical revenue. So you have more passengers, which means that there are more cars being parked next to the airport. This means that you will be able to attract more businesses into the terminals, or you may be able to raise the rents to the existing businesses, etc. And so in the end, there is kind of no clear kind of answer to this question as to whether the airport prefers dual-tail or hybrid-tail. But my point of view is that many airports would probably prefer hybrid-tail arrangement. That is the arrangement where only part of the non-aeronautical profits are used to offset the aeronautical costs. And as a matter of fact, just as an example, and one of the examples that I give in the course, the Singapore Changi Airport, which is obviously the airport that serves the city that I'm based in currently, Singapore Changi Airport uses hybrid-tail. Last time I checked, I think it was 50% of the non-aeronautical profits are used to offset the aeronautical costs, and then the airlines are billed for the rest.
Well, it's all very interesting, and I'm sure people will find it enjoyable. And there's so many things that you talk about in the course, as well as this. But let's go back to a global picture a little bit, because it would be a shame if I didn't ask you some economic questions, as you're an expert in that. So, of course, we already mentioned, but the pandemic had a huge influence on aviation industry. And we've got many players there. We've got airlines, airports, as you mentioned, air navigation system providers, and stuff like that. So which organizations do you think suffered the most in this pandemic?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, we have heard a lot about the airlines in the news. And so the airlines started losing money right away, and the governments, they have come with some kind of financial assistance, or actually most of that financial assistance was in the form of loans rather than grants, which means that the airlines would still have to repay that, and some airlines are already starting to do that. But overall, the airlines have received something like $250 billion of grants and loans, mostly loans, and that does not even also count some of the money that came to the airline workers through kind of more general programs, some more general wage assistance programs that some countries have introduced to cushion the blow of the pandemic, right? The airports, however, have also been badly affected, as well as the air navigation service providers. And the airports and ANSPs, that is the providers of air navigation services, have been kind of helped a bit by the fact that the cargo operations have remained strong, right? Let's say for air navigation service provider, the ANSP gets the same revenue regardless of whether the 747 flying in the sky is carrying passengers or cargo. As long as there is or how many passengers it's carrying, as long as there is an aircraft with a certain maximum takeoff weight, up in the air and is being controlled by this provider, the provider gets the payment, right? But on the other hand, the airlines' share of fixed costs is, generally speaking, lower than that for airports and the ANSPs. So the providers of aviation infrastructure had fewer opportunities to immediately cut their costs as opposed to the airlines. Also, especially smaller airports, they have been largely loss-making before the pandemic, and so they have been hit quite badly. But in general, to answer your question, well, the enterprises that were in better financial position before the pandemic, they also have been able to kind of withstand the storm better. Like for instance, in Europe, the low-cost carriers, Ryanair with their EasyJet, they have been able to go through this without receiving much of, if any, financial assistance. Well, Ryanair is actually keeps suing the governments left and right for providing the financial assistance to to network airlines, for instance. That's because Ryanair has been one of the most profitable airlines in the world before the pandemic. And now if you look at the figures, the Ryanair, Wizz Air, and EasyJet are the top 3 airlines in Europe by passenger traffic. Well, which is driven in part by the fact that the network carriers, that is British Airways, KLM, Lufthansa, Air France, etc., they were more reliant on the long-haul routes, which still have not recovered. Like for instance, even though currently there is the vaccinated travel lane between France and Singapore, so you can come to Singapore on direct flights from Paris without having to quarantine on arrival. That's still this arrangement is in place, but still Air France only operates 3 flights per week, whereas previously they had a daily departure, and Singapore Airlines now operates 1 daily flight rather than 2, as they did before the pandemic. So I see these the long haul routes are still have not recovered, but that's mostly because of the travel restrictions that persist.
I see. So there's one more thing that I want to ask you. One other instructor said that predicting the future is a dangerous game, but I still want to kind of play that with you, because in your article that you published back in March of 2020, just after the pandemic started, you wrote that after the pandemic is over, and I quote, "The traveling public will return to an industry that has changed." So what are the most considerable changes that you've already noticed, and what are the future predictions going forward?
Yes, actually, now that you have mentioned that article, in April of 2021, I wrote another article where I tried to evaluate my predictions that I have made when the situation, when the crisis was only starting. Because if you remember what people were thinking at that time, the prevailing thinking was that, okay, we will start seeing some recovery, let's say in the summer of 2020, and well, you know how that prediction has has panned out. And at that time, I was predicting that the airlines would start going out of business. That did not happen because the governments did step in and helped the airline industry quite a lot. As a matter of fact, fewer airlines went out of business in 2020 than did in 2019. And we are actually not seeing airlines going out of business still. So that's when we return to travel, we will still have the same airlines in the air, whether or not even though from my opinion is that some of the airlines should have gone out of business since they were not run very efficiently, but I'm not going to name any names so I'm not going to name any names here. And then for some time I think for the next couple of years, we will have to travel with masks on board, on our face as well, on board the aircraft. We will have to be travel will be more difficult for the unvaccinated, but I think that these restrictions will be gradually removed as the virus becomes endemic, which is what seems to be happening. And we already see some kind of first moves in that direction. For instance, the UK now does not require any pre-flight testing whatsoever. Then there are a lot of currently, it is a mess currently, right? So, for instance, if you're going to China, you're going to have to quarantine for 3 weeks, and if you're coming to Singapore, then it depends, right? So, for instance, I returned from the United States about 10 days ago, and because I was traveling via the vaccinated travel lane arrangement, I did not have to quarantine. I did have to take the on-arrival test and stay at home until receiving the negative test result. Whereas if you're traveling to the United States, all you have to do is be vaccinated and take a pre-departure test. And honestly, at JFK Airport, nobody actually asked me for my vaccination certificate. Only the airline was concerned about, wanted to see it. So currently, special international travel is a mess, but I think that we will gradually be moving back to the pre-pandemic travel protocol. Well, maybe we'll see the speed of this movement is going to be different, right? So I would say that most likely Europe will return to that this year, United States as well, with the exception of maybe wearing masks on board. Asia will probably be a little bit slower in that area, but then I think, for instance, Thailand or other countries that are more dependent on tourism especially from Europe and other areas, they might be opening up faster than other countries. But in the end, in the long term, we will be returning to the previous travel arrangements as the virus becomes endemic. And I mean, at the time when the pandemic was starting, I was thinking that maybe non-stop flights will be we will see more non-stop flights as people might have less confidence traveling via hub airports, but I don't think that this will be that true anymore, even though we will have more non-stop flights, but because we now have smaller aircraft that are capable of longer distance flight. For instance, quite a few transatlantic flights are already being flown by Airbus A321, the long-range version of that aircraft. As a matter of fact, my daughter was on one such flight when she went to New York, where we met, and with A321 XLR, we will see more of that. Also, the A350s, the Dreamliners, will be deployed on more long-range flights. But these changes, they don't have anything to do with the pandemic itself. That was just the trend that was starting before the pandemic and would have happened anyway.
Well, I think let's finish on this hopeful note about it all coming back to the thing that we were used to, the natural state of aviation. So thanks a lot for your time today, Volodymyr. I'm really honored to have this opportunity to kind of pick your brain a little bit, and I hope it was just as interesting to you.
It definitely was, and it's my pleasure, as I said.
Well, thanks for everyone who's watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.